Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as we welcome our second lecturer in the United States Marshals Museum Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series, Congressman Trey Gowdy from South Carolina. Please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem by Community School of the Arts, Gabrielle Gore.
What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
That is the way the national anthem should be sung. Thank you very much for coming today. I am Jim Dunn. I am the president of the U.S. Marshals Museum Foundation. And it's my pleasure and honor today to present to you the person who will introduce the speaker for the day. You all know him. Steve Womack is the congressman from the 3rd Congressional District and represents us in Washington, D.C. with a perfect voting record ever since he went to Congress in 2011. Congressman Womack has brought to Fort Smith many dignitaries from Washington, D.C. to give exposure to this wonderful community to folks who need to know about this community. He also has been a tireless advocate for Fort Smith, and he has been a tireless advocate for the United States Marshals Museum. He shepherded the coin legislation through the House of Representatives, gaining bipartisan support, and we're lucky that Senator John Bozeman did the corresponding thing for us in the United States Senate. This resulted in over $3 million being designated for the construction of the U.S. Marshals Museum, and not one penny of that was taxpayer money. It was paid by collectors who purchased those wonderful coins, which says on one side in front of a deputy U.S. Marshal, wanted in Fort Smith. So, Congressman Womack, thank you so much for your efforts in doing that. I would like to present to you at this time Congressman Steve Womack.
Thank you, Jim. Greetings to everyone, and thanks a lot, Jim, for bringing up that perfect voting record. I might as well go ahead and make my reservation at the local hospital for an appendicitis attack come Tuesday. That's when we go back, and I'm sure that record will be in jeopardy. I don't brag much about that because I know I'm just very fortunate that I've not had a personal hardship that has kept me away from my official duties in Washington. This is a special, special event that I am honored and privileged to be able to make an introduction of our keynote speaker. You know, it's a source of pride for me anytime I get an opportunity to share the attributes, and there are many, of the 3rd District of Arkansas with my colleagues. And I have that privilege today. When Jim Dunn and I spoke some weeks ago about the second in the series of lectures, he asked me about Trey Gowdy. I told him, well, Trey's a colleague. Trey is also a classmate of mine. His office is right around the corner from mine in the Rayburn building, and he's a friend. And I said, you know, Jim, the worst thing that can happen is we can ask him and he can turn us down and we can be off to our next invitee. So within minutes, I hung up the phone with Jim. I picked up my phone and I called Trey. He answered on the first ring. He always answers, hey, brother. I said, Trey, in my district, on the banks of the Arkansas River, there's going to be built a museum to honor the long-standing history of the U.S. Marshals Service. And there is this lecture series called the Rockefeller Lecture Series, where they invite people to come in and speak on behalf of certain things about our country and its formation and its history and its constitution. And the first guy to speak was the departed Justice Antonin Scalia. And as I was about to roll into my sales pitch with him, he interrupted me. He interrupted me in mid-sentence, and he said, Steve, whatever you are about to ask, and I am assuming it has something to do with me speaking, I just want you to know the answer is yes. That says everything about Trey Gowdy. He's among the most respected members of the United States House. He is in high demand. His work on the committees of intelligence, ethics, oversight, and government reform is remarkable. His steady and careful leadership as chairman of the Select Committee on Benghazi was extraordinary. He is a YouTube sensation. And when you see a few of the clips of Trey Gowdy in action, you'll understand why no bureaucrat in Washington ever wants to be cross-examined by this distinguished public servant and our speaker today. But amid all the accolades, the national press, all of his exposure, he's among the most selfless in Congress. And I want to share with you a conversation Trey and I had when we first came to Washington in 2011. He's probably forgotten the conversation. I haven't. There was a big discussion about redistricting going around our country after the decennial census. And there had been published reports out of South Carolina that in their redistricting process, it was possible that his district and a neighboring district, which, by the way, was held at the time by a man who is now the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney, that there was a lot of discussion on the Hill about a potential member-on-member primary in South Carolina. So I asked Trey about that. I said, is it possible? He said, oh, yeah, it's possible. That's what they're talking about. And I said, well, Trey, what will happen? Without hesitation, he said, I'll step aside. I said, why would you do that? He said, because Mick Mulvaney is a better legislator than I am, and he deserves to be reelected. Friends, if you've heard him speak before, you already know what a treat you're about to have. For those of you who will hear him for the first time, prepare yourself for a truly memorable address. I want you to join me as we recognize, honor, and welcome to the 3rd District of Arkansas, my friend, my classmate, and my colleague, the Honorable Trey Gowdy.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I wish my wife were here to hear that introduction. Thank you, Steve. First of all, I want to thank you for your warmth and hospitality. This is, other than traveling through Arkansas on I-40 to go to college 30 years ago, this is my first visit, and I have been overwhelmed by your warmth and hospitality and the kindness of the folks all the way from Little Rock to Fort Smith. And I rented a car, as Stevie may have said, and I drove myself down here, and I was just struck by the similarities in our two states. And I love South Carolina, and you have every reason to love your beautiful state as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for your welcome. Ms. Rockefeller, I want to thank you for last night and today, and you are such a gracious and elegant and beautiful and selfless person. And what you did last night, and you're also humble, and those things don't always go together. So you have unique attributes, and thank you for your stewardship and your commitment to the United States Marshals and your families as well. Now, yes, thank you. In my line of work, it is expected that we're going to say nice things about fellow politicians, whether they're true or not. The good news in Arkansas is that I really genuinely like your delegation. Starting with the guy that introduced me. He is a classmate, he is a colleague, he is a neighbor. He's also one of the most important words in the English language to me, which is a friend. He's an understated guy. You may or may not ever see him on YouTube. By the way, if you do watch YouTube and you wonder how in the world did somebody learn to ask questions like that, it's easy. It's 28 years of marriage. When you have to answer those questions in that tone, I'm just mimicking what happens when I go home each weekend. Womack is an understated, selfless person that puts the team ahead of himself. I'm not surprised, Steve, that you have a perfect voting record. You're just that kind of conscientious person. Tim Griffin, your lieutenant governor, was also a classmate of ours, was also a neighbor. If you're looking for any salacious, scandalous stories about Griffin, he would retire every night to his office at about 9 o'clock and watch Barnaby Jones. Seriously, he would. He would invite me almost every night to do it with him. I had the good sense to pass. But we miss you, Lieutenant Governor Griffin. Crawford is on intel with me. Bruce Westerman is new, as is French Hill. You have a phenomenal congressional delegation, and if it weren't true, I would have skipped over it and gotten straight to the meat of the discussion. I also like your two senators. Senator Bozeman, I have gotten to know over the past 2 days. He is a gentleman, and he is very well spoken. Tom Cotton, I met when he was a member of the House. And he is one of my better friends in politics. He has since left and gone to the Senate. He's doing a good job there, but he is whip smart, and he's on good committees. And I would rather be in a fight with him than against him. And I think his beautiful wife, Anna, is with him too. She's a former prosecutor, and she would have the same regard for the United States Marshals as I do. Say this about your governor last night. I got reacquainted with him. I wish everyone could have heard Governor Hutchinson last night as he just rattled off, because of his former job as a federal prosecutor, his connection to the U.S. Marshals, and his understanding of the history and the honor of that venerable group of women and men. So you have a phenomenal delegation, you have a beautiful state, and I am thrilled to be here with you. I would also be remiss if I did not mention Justice Scalia. I only met him one time in life. A colleague of ours invited Justice Scalia and a small group of members of the House to dinner, and he held court at dinner, and then we got to each ask one question. And I thought, well, I'm going to ask him about executive overreach. What if the executive branch does something that the legislative branch takes exception to? Would the courts step in? Would the courts do something? And make a note to yourself, don't ever ask Justice Scalia that question. I wish somebody told me that before I ask it. He was very pointed in his perspective on constitutional equilibrium. Justice Scalia said this, and he was more polite than this, but not by much. This is what he said: do not expect the judicial branch to do what the legislative branch is unwilling to do. Our framers gave you powerful tools. Our framers gave you punishments if necessary. The legislative branch can stick up for itself. You can stand up for yourself. You should. Do not expect the judicial branch to come in and referee fights between you and the executive branch because you will not do or exercise the powers that the framers gave you. So, Justice Scalia, you were a remarkable jurist. You had a sharp wit and a sharp pen. You wrote beautiful majority opinions, but you also wrote some of the more important dissenting opinions in our country's jurisprudence, and we're a better country as a result of your service. And I was thinking about that conversation, that one evening I ever had with Justice Scalia, and it made me think about today, the legislative branch. We have a lot of tools. We have a few punishments. We have powers. But the most important power we have is the power to make law. And I want you to ask yourself, as we walk through the next couple of minutes, what does the law mean to you? When I use the phrase law, what do you think? Is it personal? Is it some ethereal concept that you've never really spent much time thinking about? I mean, I think you have to concede it is what makes us unique among the nations. It is what makes us the greatest experiment in self-governance the world has ever known. That we are a nation of law. And we have a branch of government dedicated to passing the law, and we have a branch of government dedicated to the enforcement of the law. So what would we look like if we were not that? I had the pleasure of sitting at the table at lunch with 3 young people. 2 are in high school, 1's in junior high school. So as any parent, you immediately flash back in your mind to when your kids were that age. I have a kid in law school because that's just what the world needs, is another lawyer. And I have a kid that is in college. But I was thinking over lunch of when my own kids were that age, and my son invited me to an auditorium, not unlike this one, to hear a speaker at his high school, Spartanburg High School. And that speaker was an author from Sierra Leone, which is a country in Africa. She was she had long jet black hair and deep, rich, mahogany-colored skin. She was a beautiful young lady in her 20s, and she was speaking about life in Sierra Leone. And she did something I have never seen before, nor have I ever seen it since. She raised her arm to brush the hair out of her face, and she had no hands. Her hands had been cut off in the Sierra Leone Civil War. Soldiers had come to her village, and she tried to run, but she couldn't run fast enough. She tried to hide, but they found her. She called out for God to save her. And the soldiers got her, and they cut off her hand so she would never be able to fill out a ballot. Never be able to write a name on a ballot. And to hear this author tell her story, just before she was overcome with the shock of losing your hands to a sword, she heard the soldiers laughing and telling her to go ask the president of Sierra Leone for a new pair of hands. And this little 12-year-old girl asked herself, what's a president? You never have to ask that question. No matter whether you like or don't like any president in the history of your lifetime, you never have to wonder, what is a president? You never have to wonder, what is it like to live in a country run by lawless marauders? You never have to ask yourself. You live in a country where if you are the right age, you can be the president. You live in a country where you are welcome to say whatever you want, for or against whoever is the president. You live in a country where we think so much of the law that it is among the principal responsibilities of the woman or man that you elect president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. You live in the most unique country the world has ever known. But it is unique because of the way we view and treat the law. So I want you to ask yourself, have this conversation with yourself, not out loud, but have the conversation with yourself. What is law? What do you think it is? To me, the law is the most unifying, equalizing force that we have on our planet. What else makes the richest person in Arkansas drive the exact same speed limit as the poorest person in Arkansas? The law. What made the most successful person in Arkansas pay his or her taxes on precisely the same date as someone who is down on his or her luck in Arkansas? The law. It is the most equalizing, unifying force that we have in our country. The law. So here's what I want you to ask yourself. As majestic as the law is it self-sustaining? Does it require your input? The answer is yes. The law is both a sword and a shield. Today you may need it as a sword. You may need it to access a right that you have. Tomorrow you may need it as a shield from either a fellow citizen or a shield from the government. So you should take special care to respect the law, and the best way to respect the law is to enforce it. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I don't agree with this law and I don't agree with that law. For 16 years, I went inside a courtroom and I never once had the luxury of being able to say, I'm not going to prosecute this case because I don't think that should be against the law. It takes no courage whatsoever to follow a law that you agree with. That takes zero courage. What requires discipline, what requires courage, what makes us different is that we follow laws even that we do not agree with. And why should you not? You live in a country where you have the power to change the law. You live in a country where the government can be sued by a single individual and lose. That's the country you live in. You can go into court against the United States of America and prevail. So the law is a sword, the law is a shield, the law must be preserved. But it is not self-sustaining. It requires you to respect it. And I'm going to give you two examples that are sure to offend everyone here, and that's my objective. I want you to assume, hypothetically, that the Supreme Court redefined marriage in a way that you may disagree with. And I want you to further assume that you're a clerk of court in a nearby state. You are free to disagree with the Supreme Court decision. You are free to have someone else carry out that decision because you don't want to. You are not free to ignore that law. You're welcome to resign. You're welcome to provide other accommodations. But you do not have the luxury of ignoring a law just because you disagree with it. There are people in our country that have very different perspectives on what our narcotics trafficking statutes ought to be. There are people in this country who have very different opinions on what our immigration laws ought to be. You are free to criticize our law. You are free to advocate to your member of Congress or your senator that the law should be changed. You are not free to ignore it. You are not free to not follow it without consequence. Because once you begin to weaken the law, you weaken it forever. It is majestic. It is strong enough to bind 300 million people together. The one thing it cannot withstand is a citizenry that doesn't respect it and doesn't follow it. So I welcome you to advocate for any legal change you want to see take place. But I would caution, especially the young people, you may benefit today from the non-enforcement of a law. Tomorrow, you will cry out for the enforcement of a separate law. Once you have weakened this thing we call the law, you have weakened it forever. Something as important as the law requires something as important as those to enforce it. So I want us to think for a second about what makes women and men dedicate their careers to the enforcement of the law. The United States Marshals are not only the oldest law enforcement entity on the federal level, they actually have the broadest jurisdiction of any federal law enforcement agency. And their history has been chronicled in movies and television shows. It is the stuff of legends and heroes in history. My exposure to the U.S. Marshals is a little different, perhaps, than some of yours. I worked with them for 6 years. And when you're a federal prosecutor, from time to time, believe it or not, people don't like you. You accumulate enemies. I'm talking about outside your household. And I did that in the 1990s. I was a narcotics prosecutor and was prosecuting a case involving the murder of a federal witness. And there was a threat made. And so the U.S. Marshals came and lived with my wife and then one child. We have two now, but at the time, a 25-year-old was just a kid, a little fella. What makes people sit in other people's dens and stay up all night while the owners of that house sleep, protected and peacefully? What makes people willing to do that? If the law is special, if the law is what sets us apart, then so too should the people be that enforce it. And let me be really clear with you about this. I've never stopped and asked a police officer, do you agree with every law that you're asked to enforce? The answer, I'll bet you, would be no. Do you have the discipline to follow a law even though you do not agree with it? Once you weaken the law, you weaken it forever. And that is the single characteristic of our country that separates us from the others. Let me say this about civil disobedience, because I view the law as kind of our collective response to human nature. And I don't know what your perspective on human nature is. My wife happens to think people are inherently good, and there are just a few examples of people not acting like they should. I have a diametrically different view of human nature. But that's what you would expect between a first grade school teacher and a prosecutor. We view human nature differently. The law is our collective way of trying to codify how we manage the human condition. Think about it. It is the way that we collectively incent people to act a certain way and discourage them from acting another way. And I will never tell you the law is perfect. You can't live in a country that has our gender and racial past and argue that the law is perfect. I will never argue the law is perfect. Here's what I will argue. The best way to see the imperfection of the law is to enforce it. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense. If you have a law on the books that you think is inhumane or wrongly decided, what is your motivation to change it? The enforcement of it. You can have your own personal view of justice. You can have your own personal way of interacting with people. You and I could see the same young person today, and that young person wants to borrow some money to go to a movie. I would probably give it to him. My dad would say, you got to go cut the grass. Then I'll give it to you. You're free to have your own personal justice system, your own personal code of conduct and how you treat others. You're not free to have your own personal law. The law is our collective way of dealing with issues like this. It has to be respected. It has to be enforced. I'll never argue it is perfect. I will argue to you that the way to expose its imperfections is to enforce it. I can't speak for Arkansas. I can tell you in South Carolina, we have some crazy laws that are still on the books. When I was a district attorney, there was a law that said you can't ride a horse in a certain direction on Sunday. I don't know the origin of that law. I'm sure it seemed like a good idea at the time. But the fact that we all kind of smirk and laugh at that law, it should have been off the books decades ago. We should have enough respect for the law that we would update it, not just ignore it. That law was never enforced in South Carolina. There are other laws that are not enforced in Arkansas and at the United States level and in South Carolina. What I'm here to tell you is it disrespects the law for us to not take the time to change it, amend it, make it reflect whatever your collective conscience is today. Just don't ignore it. Don't fail to enforce it because it is politically advantageous to fail to enforce it. So the law is what makes us different, and law enforcement is every bit as different because there are people willing to risk their lives to enforce laws even that they do not agree with. Which brings me to your museum, what I call a living monument to women and men who are willing to do that. And Stevie, what made me accept your invitation, number one, I like you, but I love people that are willing to sacrifice for other people. You ever thought about what wires people to do that? What wires people to run towards danger as opposed to away from it? It's just a special calling that if you have it, you don't think twice about it, and if you don't have it, you're on all of those who do. So I want to say thank you to Arkansas, and thank you to any of you who are helping build this museum, this monument to the oldest, broadest jurisdictioned federal law enforcement agency. And I will carry with me the stories that Governor Hutchinson said last night, the profiles and courage from 100 years ago, from 20 years ago. And the reason I carry them with me is because sometimes in life, you don't say thank you on the day that you should have said thank you. You don't tell them on the day that you should have told them. And for me, that is personified in the name of a guy named Kevin Carper. Kevin Carper was a sheriff's deputy in Spartanburg County when I was a district attorney. Kevin was what we call a uniform patrol officer. He wasn't a supervisor. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a United States Marshal. He wasn't an FBI agent. He was what you will see today as you go about your life. It is just the women and men who wear uniforms and either sit in your city police vehicles or sit in your sheriff's deputies' cars. Just a regular uniform patrol officer. And Kevin got a call to respond to what some critics of law enforcement refer to as a routine call. There is no such thing as a routine call in law enforcement, but Kevin responded. And it wound up being a domestic violence call. And when Kevin and his partner got to that home on Airport Road in Spartanburg, South Carolina, William Seach was on the front porch of that mobile home with a gun pointed at his wife, Judy Seach. And Judy was hiding behind a tree in the front yard. So if you have this optic, you have William Seach on the porch, you have his wife hiding behind a tree, and William has a gun pointed at her. And Kevin and his partner show up, and they respond. And you know, people in law enforcement have a split second to make a decision. Is the gun real? Is the gun loaded? Is he going to shoot his wife? Is he not going to shoot his wife? Do we try to calm him down, or do we just fire and know that there's going to be a criminal defense attorney months down the road that second guesses every decision that you just made? So Kevin and his partner draw their weapons, and William Seach is alternating between pointing his weapon at them and pointing it at his wife, and finally he points it at his wife and pulls the trigger. So Kevin and his partner return fire. And they hit William Seach, but they don't kill him. And they rush. One rushes to check on Judy Seach, who was fatally injured by her husband. And the other officer runs to the front porch. And William Seach had been hit, but he wasn't killed. And as he approached the front porch, Kevin began to hear the cries of a child. Inside that mobile home were two children, one of whom had been struck by a bullet from Kevin's gun. She was badly injured, but she survived. And as I prepared Kevin for trial, for the murder trial of William Seach, prosecutors meet with witnesses. You have to meet with witnesses. I don't like surprises in a courtroom. So I would meet with Kevin. And I could tell from the first meeting he was bothered as only a husband and father would be who happens to be a law enforcement officer, by the fact that a projectile from his weapon struck a child. I said, Kevin, there's nothing you could have done. No way you could have known. You may have saved lives by what you did, by firing. You have no idea what he would have done. He may have gone back inside. Kevin, you got to quit worrying about it. So we got to trial, and Kevin did a phenomenal job. He showed the humanity that you want your police officers to show. But he showed the resoluteness that the decisions he made that day were the proper decisions. And I remember, because I've never had it happen before. I've never had a police officer break down in tears on the witness stand. But how could you not? If you're a husband and a father, it doesn't matter how many times people tell you you did the right thing, you hurt a child. He was fantastic. William Seach was convicted of murder. And in South Carolina, the sentencing takes place right after the trial. So I wanted to tell Kevin what a beautiful job he did, what a perfect example for the community he was of combining the professionalism of law enforcement with the humanity of a father and a husband. He was perfect. And I wanted to tell him, because I knew I'd see him again. He'd be promoted to detective. He may even be a homicide detective. I was going to see him again at some point. He was too good for me not to see him again. But I went on through with the sentencing hearing, and Kevin slipped out, and I just made a note to myself. Make sure you tell Carper what a great job he did. Next time you see him, make sure you tell him. The next time I saw Kevin, he was laying on a roadside. Having been shot and killed by a man he was trying to serve a warrant on. A man with 30 previous arrests and convictions. So I never got a chance to tell Kevin what a fantastic job he did, how much I respect the men and women of law enforcement for their professionalism and their humanity. And I don't know if you've ever been to an officer's funeral, but at the very end of the funeral, dispatch calls them. Deputy Kevin Carper, this is dispatch. Can you come in? Deputy Kevin Carper, this is dispatch. Do you read? And then there's this long, eerie silence. Deputy Kevin Carper, this is dispatch. You are cleared to go home. I waited too late. I'm really grateful to y'all for not waiting too late. What y'all are doing today takes care of all the tomorrows that those of us thought would come that never did. So thank you for building a museum and a monument to women and men who are willing to do what most of us are not willing to do. God bless you.
Please be seated. Thank you, Congressman Gowdy. 3 area students have been selected to ask the first 3 questions. Following those 3 questions and answers, if there is time, you are welcome to stand in line to ask the question. We have a hard stop at 2 o'clock p.m., so Congressman Gowdy can drive back to Little Rock and catch a plane. We were all touched by that, Congressman, beyond my words to tell you. Now, may we have the questions? Congressman, would you come back up here, please?
Hello,
Yes,
Congressman. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Blake Bolger, and I'm 17 years old. I go to Fort Smith Public Schools at Southside High School, and I wanted to ask you today about Congress. And Congress, within the last few decades, has seemed to become much more partisan. What do you think has accounted for such a primary dysfunctional legislature, and how do you think that can be resolved?
Well, that's a very good question, and like any lawyer, I'm going to take exception with one word in your question and hopes people will forget about the question by the time I get through taking exception with one of the words. No, I'm not going to do that, but I will say this. I think part of how we measure the success of a legislative body impacts whether or not you think that legislative body is successful or not. I do not view the success of a legislative body based on the number of laws that it passes. Because if it were true, then I would not be on a task force right now looking at the over-criminalization of our federal code. In other words, somebody has concluded we passed too many laws in the past, therefore we have to repeal some of them. Having said that, I also will not stand in front of you and say that we are the experiment in self-governance that Madison and others thought we would be. Here's the good news. We are far less partisan than you would think. That is true most assuredly in the House. I'm confident it's also true in the Senate. Most of us get along very, very well with each other. The fact that I can't tell you the Democrats that I get along with the best is a reflection of your underlying question, what kind of atmosphere are we in? I don't want to hurt my Democrat friends. And quite frankly, if I were to list the Democrat that I eat breakfast with on Thursday mornings, it would hurt him in his district. If I were to tell you Thursday, the Thursday we go back, the 2 Democrats that I'm going to eat dinner with, it would hurt them in their district. And quite frankly, in my district, it might not go over all that well either. We get along pretty well off camera. So what are the challenges? Redistricting is a challenge. I won't speak to Arkansas, I'll speak to South Carolina. A Democrat would have a really tough time winning in my district. Like really, really, really tough. So how can I lose? I can lose in a Republican primary. Has anybody ever lost a Republican primary because he or she was too conservative? I don't think so. So if you can only lose in a primary, then you become primary-centric. I am rarely asked at the grocery store or Walmart, why don't you work more across the aisle? I'm rarely asked that. I'm asked, why don't you fight more? I'm asked, why don't you ask tougher questions? I'm rarely asked, why don't you walk across the aisle? Every fly-in night, we vote on what's called suspensions. Those are bills that pass sometimes 435 to 0, or 434 to 1. Justin Amash is always going to vote no, but 434 to 1. Those bills don't make the news. I'm not here to bang on the media, although I'm happy to come back and do that if you'd like me to. This is what I would encourage young people to do. When I got to the hotel yesterday, I voted with my remote control. I picked a station. And that station may validate what I already believe. That station may ratify what I already believe. How much time do you spend talking to people with whom you disagree? In Washington, we talk a lot to people with whom we disagree. And if you do it in a spirit of civility and grace towards one another, you might possibly learn something you did not already know. I'm not talking about surrendering a deeply held conviction. I'm just saying, do you think out of the entire universe of things, you might can find one thing you agree with someone on? And if you do, can you put your energies into that? It's a tough environment that we're in. For 6 years, I heard from Republicans that didn't think I was conservative enough, and now I am getting reacquainted with the Democrats in my district via telephone and protest and other things. Listen to people with whom you disagree. See if there's an area that you can work together, but just understand we're not nearly as partisan as we may come across on television. That 30 seconds when you see one of the 435, there are 30 of the 435 who are meeting on some bipartisan apolitical issue. Redistricting and the willingness to have a relationship with someone even though you do not agree with them on everything, I think the younger generation probably does a little better than my generation at being willing to sort through the areas of disagreement and just find an area where you agree. With Peter Welch is a progressive from Vermont. Peter and I have found a couple of different areas where we can work together. And he's a brave soul. He's not afraid to work with a Republican from South Carolina. Up until today, I've always been afraid to publicly acknowledge that Peter and I work together. But hopefully no one from South Carolina is watching. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Garrett Spain. I'm a senior here at Greenwood High School. In 2015, you co-sponsored a bill known as the USA Freedom Act. This essentially extended and modified the Patriot Act with some restrictions on FISA court abilities. But my question is regarding the future of this type of surveillance. Given the political climate of today in the Middle East, number one, do you feel like this sort of surveillance will need to revert back to the large-scale collection methods in order to protect our homeland from a potential terrorist attack by a foreign or domestic entity? And as a continuation of that question, do you feel that the government's responsibility of protecting its citizens requires them to do something that many deem unconstitutional according to the Fourth Amendment?
Well, you just put your finger on the seminal issue, which is both national security and privacy are of constitutional dimensions, right? They're both mentioned with specificity in our Constitution. So you're balancing your Fourth Amendment privacy expectations, privacy rights, with national security. You're not balancing privacy with something that's not in the Constitution. These are two constitutional precepts. I am a former prosecutor who greatly values law and order, and I think national security is the preeminent function of government. I am probably going to reconcile that balancing differently from other people based on my background. If there's going to be an overcorrection, I am probably going to overcorrect towards national security. Why? You do have the freedom of speech, and you do have the freedom to have government seek a warrant in most instances, and you do have the freedom of a jury trial, and you do have the right to counsel, and not a single one of those rights is of much use to you if you're dead. So that's kind of the way I look at it is the life, if you want to go back to the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, life is required for you to enjoy most of your other freedoms. So I am now, having said that, and I want to give a word of compliment to Senator Cotton. Senator Cotton stood on the floor of the House and defended this nation's right to protect itself, even during a time when it wasn't all that popular to do so. He has a unique background, both military. He's a lawyer, but he wanted to go in as an infantryman and not as a lawyer. And he's on the Senate Intel Committee right now. If you were on the House Intel Committee with me and Ricky Crawford, or you were on the Senate Intel Committee with Tommy Cotton, you would see that there are lots and lots of people who want to do you harm. And they want to do you harm not because they know you and you've offended them in some way. They want to do you harm because you are an American. So you want your government protecting you. The big threat to me, not the bulk data collection, nearly as much as FISA is an agreement that we're going to allow government to have certain powers, and in exchange for those powers, you are going to protect the privacy of U.S. citizens. And when I see things leaked on the front pages of major newspapers that are supposed to remain classified and secret because they involve U.S. persons, then this agreement we made with government that we will give you power, but you have to treat it responsibly and safeguard our privacy, that agreement is subject to being renegotiated. So what I would tell my friends at the Department of Justice is, if you want Tom Cotton, Steve Womack, Ricky Crawford, French, Bruce, Senator Bozeman, you want us to defend the reauthorization programs, take the leaks seriously and do something about them. It's a felony to disseminate classified information, and I'd like to see the leaks taken just as seriously as the last questioner took the right to privacy. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Eden Adams. I'm 13 and I go to Greenwood Junior High. As young people, we're known as Generation IY for being afloat with no real aim, arrogant with no real confidence, and entitled. We want to earn back our reputation and prove our critics wrong. Help us do that. How can we impact politics and make a difference that matters without waiting until we're old enough to vote?
Well, let me just say, you're none of those things you just said. I want to compliment your generation. I have a daughter that is just a little bit older than you are, and your generation is understanding of people's differences, and you are more inclusive than my generation ever was. So I think y'all are doing great. Now, if you want to do even greater, access information is what I would tell you if you were my child. You can believe what you want, but you have to be able to explain to me why you believe it. So for my daughter, who briefly flirted with Bernie fever, it's a parenting mistake on my behalf. But what I told her was, you can believe whatever you want, you just have to be able to tell me why. So when you hear the words free, just understand that that's not the right word. It may be free to you, it is not free. So educate yourself, understand that there are 3 or 4 different positions on almost every seminal issue of the day. And don't ever stop asking the question, why? Your generation, to me, does a better job than my generation. I truly mean that. I'm in schools all the time, and I think young people today are more understanding and accepting of one another than my generation was. So y'all are to be commended for that. I would just encourage you to not believe everything that you read on your phones. I know not to say papers, because y'all don't know what a newspaper is. Your phones. Ask why. Ask, how do you know that? And just understand that people who disagree with you, we got to find a way to stop the demagoguery. The fact that somebody disagrees with me does not mean they're un-American. It doesn't mean that they don't care about this, that, or the other. Sometimes people just disagree. And that's okay. Go find something you agree on. Be educated. Understand there's more than one position on almost every issue. Don't ever stop asking the question, why? And how do you know that? Who says that's true? And just understand the word free Usually just means you ain't paying for it.
Congressman Gowdy, Congressman Womack, Mrs. Rockefeller, and family, thank you so much, and thank you for coming. We're dismissed.